All right, what's going on, y'all? Political ideology iceberg. We have got a lot to talk about. It's gonna be fun. Happy holidays, and let's get right into it. All right, so first off, we're gonna be starting in tier 1, and we're gonna be talking about communism. And communism is a political and economic ideology advocating for a classless society where all property and resources are collectively owned by the people rather than individuals or private entities. Its core idea is to eliminate class divisions and ensure wealth and power are distributed equally so everyone can have equal access to resources and opportunities. And this concept is rooted in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' ideas and influenced political movements and governments throughout the 20th century. Although its implementation often faced significant political and economic challenges, by the late 20th century, the influence of communism declined, particularly after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. While countries like China, Cuba, and Vietnam still maintain communist governments, they increasingly incorporate market-oriented reforms alongside one-party rule. And the legacy of communism remains debated, balancing its theoretical ideas against the practical outcomes, which include economic difficulties and political repression. So for each one of these political ideologies, I'm going to try to include like a movie or a TV show that can be closely tied to the form of political ideology just for fun, and it'll kind of make it a little bit easier to understand some of these. Some of them end up being a reach as we go deeper. I hope it kind of helps. And if you have any ideas on forms of media that you can equate a certain ideology to, please share it in the comments so that other people can learn. Yeah. Anyways, there's a film, Equilibrium, that was released in 2002, and in this dystopian film, a future society completely bans emotions to eliminate conflict and desires that could create inequality. The government distributes resources equally, but at the cost of individual freedom and personal property, which has also been seen in real time when communism has been practiced. We can also see this in The Giver, based off of Lois Lowry's novel, that depicts a society that eliminates pain, suffering, and inequality by enforcing a strictly controlled, classless society where people are assigned roles and resources are managed centrally. However, individuality and choice are sacrificed, suggesting potential flaws in the structure of communism. All right, next up we're going to be talking about welfarism. And welfarism is an economic and social policy approach that emphasizes the government's role in ensuring citizens' well-being, particularly by supporting those in need. Through welfarism, the state funds and manages public services like healthcare, education, housing, and social security, aiming to reduce poverty, inequality, and social hardship. Now, taxes fund these programs to create a safety net for the vulnerable and promote fair wealth distribution. And this was popularized in the 20th century, especially in Western Europe. Welfarism is often associated with welfare states where governments actively balance economic growth with social protection. Now we can see this in The Expanse, which is a TV series where Earth operates with a universal basic income system where the government actually provides a safety net for its citizens, as those who can't find work rely on state-provided welfare, though the series also highlights the strain on resources and the challenges of managing such a large welfare system. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about progressivism, and this is a social and political philosophy focused on reform and improvement, addressing social inequalities, expanding rights, and promoting fairness and justice. Progressives believe that government action could drive positive change, addressing issues like economic inequality, civil rights, environmental protection, healthcare, and education. And the movement emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century in response to the negative effects of industrialization, such as worker exploitation and corruption. And today, progressivism continues to advocate for policies that support marginalized groups, protect individual freedoms, and adapt government functions to meet modern societal values and needs. This can be seen in the TV show Parks and Recreations, or Parks and Rec, which is centered on the Parks Department in the fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana, and the show humorously depicts local government efforts led by Leslie Knope, who is essentially a public servant with progressive values. The show tackles issues like gender equality, community development, and public health, while also highlighting the challenges and rewards of implementing progressive changes at a local level. We could also see this in the TV show The Newsroom, which follows journalists working to bring truthful, socially conscious reporting to the public, often engaging with progressive issues like corporate responsibility, government transparency, and civil rights. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about authoritarianism, and this is a form of government marked by a strong central power and restricted political freedoms, where leaders or ruling groups hold substantial control over the state, often diminishing or removing checks and balances, free elections, and independent media. In this system, citizens typically have limited influence on political decisions, and opposition is often restricted or suppressed. And authoritarian regimes justify their control by claiming it brings stability, efficiency, or security, prioritizing order and national unity over individual rights. Now, this form of rule can manifest in various political systems, from monarchies to military dictatorships, and it's generally just based on concentrating power in the hands of few while limiting freedoms to maintain control. We could see this in the film 1984, and this is based off of George Orwell's novel, and this film is a classic portrayal of authoritarianism, depicting a dystopian society where the government, led by Big Brother, exercises total control over all aspects of life, and individual freedoms are severely limited, and any dissent is completely crushed, reflecting a society under total authoritarian rule. This could also be seen in The Handmaid's Tale, which is a TV series based on Margaret Atwood's novel, in which the authoritarian theocratic regime of Gilead controls every aspect of society, especially the lives of women, who have nearly all their rights taken from them, and the government uses repression, fear, and propaganda to maintain order and suppress opposition. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about monarchism. And monarchism is a political ideology supporting monarchy as a form of government where a king, queen, or emperor serves as the head of state, usually for life and often through hereditary succession. Now, monarchies can range from absolute, where the monarch holds total power, to constitutional, where their powers are restricted by laws or a constitution, making them primarily ceremonial figures while elected officials handle governance. Now, this is all rooted in the belief that monarchy provides stable, continuous leadership and values tradition and national unity. And while monarchies were historically widespread, they are now less common and mostly constitutional, particularly in Europe and parts of Asia, where they coexist with democratic institutions. We can see this in The Crown, and this is a series that depicted the life of Queen Elizabeth II and the British royal family, showcasing a constitutional monarchy in modern times. And you could also see this in The Lion King, which features an animal kingdom ruled by a lion monarch. The monarchy in the Pride Lands is absolute, with power being passed through hereditary succession, as it goes from Mufasa to Simba, and to Kovu and Kiara, right? Because they get married, right? I don't know. This can also be seen in The Tudors, which is a historical drama that focuses on the reign of King Henry VIII of England, and Braveheart, which was primarily about Scottish resistance against English rule, but also depicts the monarchy of England under King Edward I as an absolute power. And as we know, the king's actions drive the Scottish rebellion, exploring the consequences of unchecked royal authority. And lastly, this can also be seen in The King, which was loosely based on Shakespeare's Henriade plays, and the film follows Prince Hal, who becomes King Henry V, played by Timothée Chalamet. It's a really good movie. It portrays a monarchy with absolute power, focusing on themes of duty, leadership, and the burdens of royal responsibility. All right, next up, we're going to talk about liberalism, and this is a political and social ideology that emphasizes individual freedoms, equality, and the protection of civil rights within a democratic framework and rule of law. Rooted in Enlightenment ideas, it advocates for limited government interference in personal and economic matters, promoting free markets, private property, and personal autonomy. Liberals support representative democracy, free speech, religious freedom, and legal equality, believing that government should protect these rights while allowing people to make their own choices. Now, modern liberalism often includes a focus on social welfare and government action to reduce inequality, though its core remains centered on safeguarding individual freedoms and promoting a fair, open society. Now, it's kind of hard to find a movie that depicts liberalism because it's so broad. It could be seen kind of in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which was a classic film following an idealistic young senator who goes to Washington, D.C. with the aim of promoting honesty and democracy as he fights corruption, upholding the principles of individual freedom, equality, and fair governance. And it could also be seen in Forrest Gump, which is not explicitly about liberalism, but Forrest, kind of navigates through key moments in U.S. history that align with liberal principles, including civil rights, social change, and freedom of expression. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about moderatism, and this is a political philosophy that emphasizes centrist, balanced approaches to policy, avoiding extremes on either side of the political spectrum. Moderates believe in practical, adaptable solutions and often prioritize compromise to achieve broad consensus, valuing stability and incremental change over radical reforms. Now, rather than aligning strictly with conservative or liberal ideologies, moderatism values reasoned dialogue and solutions that incorporate multiple perspectives. This could be seen in The West Wing, which was a political drama about people working in the White House, and it often portrays a balanced approach to governance, considering it was, a TV show, with the administration of President Josiah Bartlett working to find middle ground on divisive issues, and the show frequently highlights the challenges of crafting moderate, pragmatic policies in a polarized political landscape. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about Nazism, and Nazism, or National Socialism, is an extreme far-right ideology and political movement led by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany from the early 1930s until the end of World War II in 1945. Rooted in fascist principles, Nazism promoted intense nationalism, militarism, and the belief in the racial superiority of the Aryan race. The Nazi regime aimed to create a totalitarian state with strict control over society, government, and the economy while pursuing aggressive territorial expansion. This ideology was also marked by violent anti-Semitism, leading to the systematic persecution and genocide of the Jews, also known as the Holocaust, and the targeting of other groups deemed, quote, undesirable. Nazis and its leaders were responsible for some of history's most horrific atrocities, causing widespread devastation in Europe and contributing to the onset of World War II. Now, The Man in the High Castle kind of portrayed Nazism well, and this was based on Philip K. Dick's novel and was a TV series that imagines an alternate history where the Axis powers, including Nazi Germany and Japan, won World War II and occupied the United States, and the society reflects extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, and racial hierarchy, showcasing the chilling effects of Nazi-inspired rule on everyday life. And Wolfenstein would also be a good game that depicts this. You're basically just killing Nazis after they won World War II. You could also see this in Inglourious Bastards, which was directed by Quentin Tarantino and was a film that presents an alternate history of Nazi-occupied France during World War II, where resistance fighters attempt to assassinate high-ranking Nazi officials and they kill Hitler. And though it's highly stylized, the film offers a portrayal of Nazi ideology and the violent oppressive control exercised by the regime. If you haven't seen it, just watch like the first 20 minutes of the film. There's a character, Hans Landa, played by Christoph Waltz, and oh my god, it's really good. And this can also be seen in Schindler's List. And while based on historical events, the film provides a powerful depiction of Nazi ideology, the horrors of the Holocaust, the portrayal of Nazi officials, and the brutality inflicted on Jewish people. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about fascism. And fascism is a far-right authoritarian ideology advocating for centralized government control, strict social hierarchy, and often a dictatorial leader. Emerging in early 20th century Italy under Mussolini, it rejects democratic values, individual rights, and pluralism, instead emphasizing loyalty to the state, nationalism, and militarism. Fascist regimes seek to unify the population under a single national identity, suppressing dissent and controlling many facets of life, including media, education, and culture, believing that violence and conflict may be necessary tools to achieve national goals. And fascist ideologies have also spread to other countries, most notably Germany and Spain. Now, this can be seen in Starship Troopers, as the film is presented as a satirical take on militarism and authoritarianism and depicts a future society with fascist elements, including strict social hierarchy, propaganda-driven nationalism, and the glorification of military service, as citizenship is earned through service, reinforcing a hierarchical and controlled society. All right, next up, we're going to talk about conservatism. And this is a political and social philosophy focused on tradition, stability, and the preservation of established institutions and values. Conservatives typically advocate for limited government intervention in the economy, emphasizing free markets, personal responsibility, and a cautious approach to change, favoring gradual adjustments over rapid reforms. In social matters, conservatism often upholds traditional family structures, cultural norms, and religious values, viewing these as essential to a stable society. And while conservatism varies by context, its core aim is to maintain social order and continuity protecting heritage and established ways of life. This can be seen in the show Father Knows Best, as it's a classic American sitcom that epitomizes the post-war conservative values of family, stability, and traditional gender roles. The show presents an idealized version of American family life where the father is the head of the household, emphasizing personal responsibility and social order. We could also see this in To Kill a Mockingbird, and though it's primarily about justice and racism, the setting of this film adaptation reflects a conservative small-town society with deeply rooted traditions and social norms. And it shows Atticus Finch, Scout's dad, while progressive in his own views, operates within a community that values tradition and social continuity. Do they still make people read To Kill a Mockingbird? I had to read it in middle school, man. It was rough. And this could also be seen in It's a Wonderful Life. And this is a classic film, top tier Christmas movie. And it also reflects conservative themes of community, family, and personal responsibility, rejecting the pursuit of wealth and personal ambition for the sake of a stable and happy life. It's a Wonderful Life. Happy holidays. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about capitalism. And capitalism is an economic system where private individuals or businesses own and operate the means of production, distribution, and exchange with the goal of generating profit. Goods and services are produced and sold in a competitive market, with prices largely driven by supply and demand. Capitalism emphasizes individual entrepreneurship, economic freedom, and minimal government interference, with the belief that these factors can foster innovation, efficiency, and overall wealth creation. People earn income based on work, investments, and business activities, enjoying the freedom to buy, sell, and invest as they choose. Although capitalism has driven substantial economic growth and innovation, it can also lead to inequality, as wealth tends to concentrate among those with the most capital. Now, capitalism can be seen and portrayed in The Wolf of Wall Street, and this is based on the true story of Jordan Belfort, and the film portrays the highs and lows of Wall Street capitalism, highlighting both the allure of wealth and the excesses of greed and unethical behaviors that can emerge within a profit-driven competitive market. It could also be seen in Mad Men, and this was a TV show set in the 1960s advertising industry that captures the spirit of American capitalism, focusing on the Madison Avenue advertising executives who shape consumer culture, exploring themes of competition, individual ambition, and the impact of capitalism on personal and social values. It could also be seen in The Social Network, which was a movie chronicling the founding of Facebook, and the film showcases the competitive and profit-driven nature of capitalism in the tech industry, exploring themes of innovation, rivalry, entrepreneurship, and the personal costs of pursuing success in a capitalist economy. And this could also be seen in American Psycho, which is a kind of satirical film that shows the excesses and morals associated with Wall Street capitalism in the 1980s. As the main character, a wealthy investment banker, epitomizes the shallow obsession with wealth, status, and consumerism often associated with unchecked capitalism. He goes fucking insane. He goes nuts. He goes nuts. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about Marxism. And Marxism is a socio-economic and political ideology developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that critiques capitalism and advocates for a classless society where resources and production are collectively owned. According to Marxist theory, society is divided into classes, primarily the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, who own the means of production, and the proletariat or the working class, who sell their labor in exchange for wages. Now, Marxism argues that capitalism will inherently exploit workers or the proletariat, me and you, unless you think you're part of the bourgeoisie, and this in turn creates inequality and class struggle, which will eventually lead the working class to overthrow the capitalist system. Now, this transition would begin with socialism, which we'll talk about later, where the state controls resources for the public good, and ultimately would lead to communism, a stateless, classless society where wealth and power are equally distributed. Now, this can be seen in Snowpiercer, and in this post-apocalyptic universe, humanity is confined to a train where strict class divisions are enforced, as the lower class passengers live in poverty at the back of the train, and the wealthy enjoy luxury at the front. And the story actually follows a rebellion led by the oppressed, echoing Marxist themes of class struggle and eventual revolution. This could also be seen in Elysium, which is a film set in the future where wealthy people live on a luxurious space station nation while the poor remain on a polluted, overpopulated earth. And the film critiques the capitalist system and explores the inequality between classes, as our protagonist, played by Matt Damon, challenges the system, mirroring the Marxist ideal of the working class rising against capitalist oppression. We also see this in the Hunger Games, which, a lot of people have probably seen. And if you were like me reading the Hunger Games in elementary school, congrats. You're a communist. It's okay. In this dystopian society, the wealthy capital exploits and controls the resources of the impoverished districts, forcing them into labor and servitude and, of course, the Hunger Games in order to kind of stabilize this whole system. And the series portrays a revolution led by the oppressed and our protagonist, Katniss Everdeen, echoing Marxist themes of class struggle, exploitation, and resistance. And lastly, this can also be seen in A Bug's Life, which is an animated film that tells the story of oppressed worker ants under the control of grasshoppers who take their resources. The ants eventually realize their power in numbers and revolt against the bourgeoisie, echoing Marxist themes of collective action and overthrowing oppressive systems. All right, next up, where do we talk about socialism? And socialism is an economic and political system where the means of production, such as factories, land, and resources, are collectively owned and managed by the public or the state rather than private individuals. Its central goal is to reduce inequality by distributing wealth equitably and ensuring access to essential needs like healthcare, education, and housing for all members of society. And in socialist systems, the government often plays a significant role in planning and regulating the economy, aiming to balance the interests of all citizens instead of prioritizing profit. Socialism emphasizes worker rights, social welfare, and collective responsibility, advocating that everyone shares both the benefits and responsibilities of production. This can be seen in the movie Animal Farm, which is based off of George Orwell's allegorical novel, which follows a group of animals who overthrow their human owner to establish an egalitarian society. However, it also ends up becoming a critique of how revolutions can be corrupted, as it begins with ideals of equality, shared resources, and collective ownership, but eventually can be manipulated into an authoritarianist structure. All right, next up, what do we talk about? Environmentalism. And environmentalism is a social and political movement advocating for the protection and preservation of the natural environment from human-caused degradation. Environmentalists emphasize conserving natural resources, reducing pollution, protecting biodiversity, and addressing climate change to sustain a healthy planet for current and future generations. This movement promotes practices like recycling, reducing waste, transitioning to renewable energy, and supporting policies that regulate harmful emissions and safeguard ecosystems, and push for lifestyle changes and government action to minimize damage and encourage conservation. Now, this could be seen in Princess Mononoke, which is an animated film set in a world where industrial expansion threatens ancient forests and their guardian spirits, and explores the conflict between industrial progress and environmental preservation with a strong message about the need to respect nature and live in harmony with it. Of course, we see this in the Lorax, and this is based off of Dr. Seuss's book, which is an animated film that tells the story of a town, the Needville, that lost all of its trees due to industrial greed, and the Lorax is a creature who speaks for the trees and advocates for conservation and environmental stewardship, emphasizing the importance of protecting natural resources and combating deforestation. And this is also kind of seen in the movie Annihilation, which is beautiful. And this is a sci-fi film that features a mysterious ecological zone where nature has mutated in strange ways, and the story explores the beauty and power of nature as well as humanity's impact on it, ultimately delivering a surreal yet cautionary message about environmental change and adaptation. All right, next up, we're going to talk about feminism. And feminism is a social, political, and cultural movement advocating for equal rights and opportunities for all genders, with a focus on addressing the inequalities faced by women. It seeks to dismantle gender-based discrimination, stereotypes, and social norms that restrict women's rights, resources, and societal participation. Feminism promotes issues like equal pay, reproductive rights, protection against gender-based violence, and representation in leadership roles. Feminism now includes diverse perspectives, addressing intersecting issues related to race, sexuality, and class, while its core mission still remains gender equality and empowerment free from gender-based discrimination. Now, themes of this can be seen in Barbie, which is widely considered a feminist film. It presents themes of self-discovery, gender equality and the empowerment of women, challenging traditional stereotypes about femininity and the role of women in society. We also see this in Hidden Figures, which is based on the true story of 3 black women mathematicians at NASA in the 1960s, and the film highlights their contributions to the US space program despite the barriers of gender and racial discrimination. Of course, it's also portrayed in Mulan in both the animated and live-action version. As the main character, Mulan defies gender norms by taking her father's place in the army, proving her capability and courage, also challenging societal expectations about gender roles, and embodying feminist ideals of equality and self-empowerment. Alright, next up we're going to talk about democracy. And democracy is a system of government where power is vested in the people, who exercise it directly or through elected representatives. Citizens participate in decision-making by voting in free and fair elections, choosing leaders, and influencing policies, and core principles include majority rule, protection of individual rights, equality under the law, and freedoms of speech, press, and assembly, with elected officials accountable to the people and removable if they fail to represent their constituents' interests. This can be seen in The American President, which is a film that focuses on a fictional US president navigating the challenges of democracy, including public opinion, media scrutiny, and political opposition. And it also emphasizes democratic values like transparency, respect for diverse perspectives, and the importance of leaders serving the people. Alright, next up we're going to talk about dictatorship. And dictatorship is a form of government in which a single individual or small group holds absolute power, often without constitutional limitations or democratic processes. In this system, the ruler or ruling group makes decisions unilaterally with little or no public input and typically suppresses opposition through censorship, propaganda, or force, restricting freedoms like speech, assembly, and press in order to maintain control. Dictators justify their rule claiming that it brings stability or security, often using military or police forces to enforce their own authority. This form of government can be seen in The Dictator, which is completely satirical, that stars Sacha Baron Cohen as a dictator of a fictional country, and humorously showcases the absurdities and excesses of dictator rule. This could also be seen in Star Wars, as the Galactic Empire is led by Emperor Palpatine, and is a classic example of dictatorship in sci-fi, as the Empire uses military force, propaganda, and repression to control the galaxy. And this can also be seen in The Great Dictator, 1940, which is a Charlie Chaplin film that satirizes Adolf Hitler, as Charlie Chaplin, well, plays Adolf Hitler. Yeah. Alright, next up we're going to talk about apoliticism, and this is the stance of being uninterested or actively avoiding political involvement. Now, apolitical individuals or groups refrain from taking positions on political issues, participating in activities, or supporting ideologies, parties, or candidates, often due to a desire for neutrality, disillusionment with politics, or a belief that political engagement is unproductive. Now, this can be seen in The Truman Show, which is a satirical drama that follows our character Truman, a man who unknowingly lives his life as the subject of a reality TV show. His world is carefully constructed to avoid any political issues or discussions, with the emphasis on entertainment and maintaining an idealized apolitical environment, as the society is designed to keep Truman isolated from any real-world concerns. It is also kind of seen in The Matrix, as in the world of The Matrix, most humans are oblivious to the real political or philosophical struggles that exist outside the simulated world, while our protagonists like Neo fight against the system, but the general populace is unaware or uninterested in the political struggle taking place. They're in the Matrix. It's also portrayed in the Lego Movie, which is an animated film presenting a society where everyone is encouraged to conform and follow the rules, with very little room for political discourse or independence. The characters outside of our main characters are apolitical, focusing on creativity and individualism only when they begin to challenge the system, showing a subtle critique of apolitical conformity and control. Hence, everything being awesome. Alright, next up we're going to talk about totalitarianism, and this is a form of government where the state seeks to control over nearly every aspect of public and private life, usually under a single leader or ruling party with absolute authority. The government controls economy, education, culture, and even personal beliefs to create a society fully aligned with its ideology. Tools like propaganda, censorship, and surveillance maintain control, suppress dissent, and ensure conformity, with severe punishment for opposition. Of course, we can again see this in Fahrenheit 451, and also The Running Man, which is an action film set in a totalitarian future where the government controls the media and uses a deadly game show to distract the population and maintain control. It's kind of like the OG Hunger Games, basically. Actually, Battle Royale is kind of like the OG Hunger Games. I don't know. Y'all should watch that movie. That's also a good movie. We got a lot of good movie recommendations going on here. In the comments, you're probably going to see people from both the left and the right arguing about shit, but just drop some good movie recs, because, yeah, I don't know. Whatever. Moving on. All right, next up, we're going to talk about nationalism. And nationalism is a political and social ideology that emphasizes strong loyalty and devotion to one's nation, often prioritizing its interests, culture, and identity over others. Nationalists value national unity, pride, and sovereignty, seeing their nation as unique and deserving of self-determination. This ideology encourages celebrating cultural heritage, language, and traditions, fostering a shared identity among citizens, but it can also lead to tensions with other nations if it fosters exclusionary attitudes or beliefs in superiority. Now, this can be seen kind of in Independence Day, as the film is centered on the defense of Earth from an alien invasion, with the narrative focusing on national pride, national being the Earth, and unity as the nations of the world come together to resist the extraterrestrial threat. And this could also be seen in Avatar, as we are shown water, earth, fire, air, yeah, all the nations living together in harmony, but the nationalist Fire Nation attacks, as they have a quest for expansion, rooted in the belief that they are superior and that their national identity should dominate the others, leading to war and conflict. All right, next up, we're talking about classical liberalism, and this is a political and economic ideology from the 18th and 19th centuries that advocates for individual freedoms, limited government, and free market economics. It's rooted in Enlightenment ideas, and it emphasizes personal liberty, property rights, and the rule of law, arguing that the government's role is to protect these rights rather than interfering in the economy or private lives. Couldn't really find a film or anything that represents this. It's kind of really broad, niche too. But yeah, moving on. All right, next up, we're talking about libertarianism, and this is a political philosophy that emphasizes individual freedom, personal responsibility, and minimal government intervention in personal and economic matters. Libertarians believe that people should be free to make their own choices as long as they don't harm others, with government functions limited to essential roles like protecting property rights and ensuring public safety. The Dark Knight is a libertarian film. Hear me out. While not explicitly libertarian, it touches on themes of individual freedom versus government intervention, as the film explores the balance between security and liberty, particularly through the character of Batman, who operates outside of the law to ensure justice and protect Gotham from the threat represented by the Joker, society. I don't know. It was kind of a stretch. I just wanted to throw in a movie. All right, next up, we're talking about collectivism. And collectivism is a social and political philosophy that emphasizes the importance of group goals, interests, and well-being over individual desires and independence. It encourages people to prioritize the needs of community, society, or state above personal interests, often seen in systems where resources and responsibilities are shared, such as communal work, cooperative ownership, or government-managed structures. Now, this could be seen in Divergent, as in this film adaptation of the book. The society depicted in Divergent shows people being divided into factions based on their own personal values, and the collective good of the faction is prioritized over the individual. The society emphasizes group identity, loyalty, and cooperation, with individual desires often suppressed for the sake of social harmony and the stability of the system. This could also be seen kind of at the beginning of the 100, as in this TV series. Survivors of nuclear apocalypse live on a spaceship and then eventually Earth, and in the beginning, when they come to Earth, their society prioritizes collective survival over individual desires, trying to maintain order within their community. All right, next up, we're going to talk about social democracy, and this is a political and economic ideology that seeks to balance the benefits of a market-based economy with government policies that promote social welfare and reduce inequality. Social democrats support a democratic political system with free elections and individual rights, while advocating for a strong role of government in providing public services such as healthcare, education, and social security. They believe that capitalism can coexist with social justice if properly regulated, emphasizing policies like progressive taxation, labor protections, and welfare programs to ensure a fair distribution of wealth and economic activities. All right, next up, we're going to talk about pacifism, and this is an ethical and philosophical stance that opposes war, violence, and the use of force to resolve conflicts, advocating instead for peaceful solutions through negotiation, diplomacy, and nonviolent resistance. Pacifists believe that violence only perpetuates harm and suffering, and that ethical and constructive approaches are essential to achieving lasting peace and justice. This can be seen in Selma, which is a powerful historical drama that depicts the 1965 voting rights marches from Selma to Montgomery, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We could also see this in Gandhi, which is a historical biographical film about Mahatma Gandhi, focusing on his advocacy for nonviolent resistance to oppose British colonial rule in India. And we could see this in The Iron Giant, an animated film that features a giant robot who is capable of destruction but chooses to adopt pacifist ideals, ultimately deciding to sacrifice himself to save others rather than to cause harm. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about anarchism. And this is a political philosophy that advocates for a society without centralized authority or government, arguing that people can organize themselves voluntarily in communities based on mutual aid, cooperation, and shared responsibilities. Anarchists believe that hierarchical structures such as governments and large corporations inherently lead to oppression and inequality, and they advocate for their replacement with decentralized, self-managed systems where individuals and communities govern themselves. Although commonly associated with anti-authoritarianism and direct action, anarchism prioritizes peaceful, non-coercive forms of social organization, and its ideals have inspired movements that seek social justice, labor rights, and the protection of individual freedoms, though critics question its practicality on a larger scale due to the absence of formal structures for order and conflict resolution. You can kind of see this in The Walking Dead, as in a post-apocalyptic world where centralized government and social structures have collapsed. Survivors must rely on mutual aid and cooperation to rebuild society. And next, we're going to talk about egalitarianism, and this is a philosophy that advocates for equal rights, opportunities, and treatment for all individuals, aiming to eliminate economic, social, and political inequalities. They believe that everyone should have fair access to resources and opportunities, regardless of factors like race, gender, class, or background. And this belief can influence various areas, from economic policies that redistribution to social movements focused on civil rights and justice. All right, next up, we're talking about globalism, and this is a political and economic ideology that emphasizes the interconnectedness and interdependence of nations, advocating for cooperation across borders to address shared challenges and promote mutual prosperity. Globalism supports the idea that countries benefit from open trade, international agreements, and cultural exchange, which can lead to economic growth, innovation, and diplomatic stability. Proponents argue that globalism fosters a sense of global citizenship where people and nations work together to tackle issues like climate change, poverty, and security. And today, it's influenced many aspects of modern life, from global supply chains to multinational institutions like the United Nations and World Trade Organization. We can see this in Demolition Man, which is a film set where the world has become highly regulated and presents a vision of society where the government has eliminated violence and crime, and international cooperation has led to the unification of global forces into a somewhat peaceful, highly controlled society. We could also see themes of this in Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and in this MCU film, globalism is portrayed through the cooperation between nations, exemplified by SHIELD, a multinational organization tasked with maintaining global security. However, the film also adds a critique on the potential dangers of global power structures, as SHIELD's actions become increasingly secretive and authoritarian, ultimately leading to questions about transparency and accountability in global governance, particularly when they are manipulated from the inside. All right, next up, we're going to talk about militarism, and this is an ideology that prioritizes the role of the military in a society and supports the maintenance of a strong, well-prepared armed forces to protect national interests and assert power. In militaristic societies, the military often has a prominent influence on government policy, culture, and economics, sometimes with significant resources devoted to defense spending and the development of advanced weaponry. Militarism can also shape public attitudes to favor strength, discipline, and patriotism, and it often involves the belief that military power is essential for national security, stability, or prestige. We can see this in G.I. Joe and the 2000s movies and kind of the cartoons, where they are set in a world where military organizations are the forefront of global defense, and the fictional G.I. Joe team represents a force of elite soldiers fighting against the militaristic Cobra organization, which seeks world domination through military might, advanced weapons, and advanced technology. And I guess you could also see this in Star Wars, again, for obvious reasons. All right, next up, we're going to talk about statism, and this is a political ideology that emphasizes a strong central government and plays a significant role in regulating and managing economic and social affairs. Statists believe that the state should actively intervene to provide order, security, and welfare for its citizens, often advocating for government control over key industries, infrastructure, or resources to ensure stability and public benefit. All right, next up we're talking about theocracy, and this is a form of government in which religious leaders or institutions hold political power, ruling in accordance with the principles and doctrines of a particular religion. In a theocratic system, laws and policies are heavily influenced, if not entirely, dictated by religious beliefs, and leaders may claim authority based on divine guidance or sacred texts. Theocracy often merges religious and political roles, with religious authorities interpreting laws and guiding governance. And this is also represented in Dune. Oh my god, my favorite movie. And in Dune, the planet Arrakis is basically governed by Paul, who is also low-key influenced by the Bene Gesserit, and the whole political system is influenced by this religion revolving around Paul, the Lisan al-Gaib, who wields power partly through his religious symbolism. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good movie. Watch it. Yeah. Moving on. All right, next up we're going to talk about racism. And racism is a belief and social practice that involves discriminating against or viewing people as inherently inferior or superior based on their race or ethnicity. It involves stereotypes, prejudice, and systematic inequalities that favor one racial group over others, leading to unequal access to resources, opportunities, and rights. Now we can see this in Harry Potter.
No one asked your opinion, you filthy little
There are racist wizards. You know, you have your pure-blooded wizards, and you have your filthy mudbloods. Also in X-Men, you could see mutants as an allegory for race. People hate those dirty fucking mutants. And more non-fiction movies like Black Klansman, based on a true story, it follows Ron Stallworth, the first African-American detective in the Colorado Springs Department, as he infiltrates the Ku Klux Klan. And back to fiction, you can see it in District 9, which is an allegory of apartheid, focusing on the oppression and segregation of an alien race by humans in South Africa. And yeah, racism is bad. All right, next up we're going to talk about federalism. And federalism is a political system in which power is divided between a central or national government and a regional, state, or provincial government, each with its own areas of authorities. This division allows different levels of government to handle specific responsibilities. For instance, the central government might oversee defense and foreign policy, while regional governments manage local matters like education and public safety. And federalism aims to balance the benefits of a strong national government with the advantages of local governance that could be more responsive to regional needs and differences. Now, of course, we can see this in Star Trek, as we have the United Federation of Planets, who operate as a federation of diverse planets and species, where individual member planets retain a degree of autonomy, but the central government oversees interplanetary diplomacy, defense, and exploration. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about tribalism. And tribalism is a social system and mindset in which people are strongly loyal to their own group, often defined by shared identity markers like kinship, culture, language, or beliefs. This loyalty fosters a sense of belonging and unity within a group, creating close social bonds and mutual support. And in a traditional sense, tribalism refers to societies organized around clans or tribes, where members share common ancestry and cultural practices. In modern contexts, however, tribalism can define a tendency for people to identify strongly with certain groups, such as political parties, social movements, or ideological communities, sometimes leading to an us versus them mentality. You can see this in Mad Max, as set in a post-apocalyptic world. It features various tribes and groups, each with its own identity, culture, and way of survival, such as the War Boys, led by Immortan Joe. Also, we see this in The Walking Dead, and kind of in The Lord of the Flies, as this film, based on William Golding's novel, depicts a group of boys stranded on an uninhabited island who form their own little tribal society. All right, next up we're going to talk about imperialism. And imperialism is a policy or ideology where a country extends its power and influence over other nations, often through conquest, colonization, or economic and political control. This expansionist approach allows an imperialist nation to exploit resources, labor, and markets in the dominated regions, typically for its own economic and strategic benefit. Imperialism often involves establishing colonies, controlling trade routes, or installing public governments to secure dominance. And historically, imperialism was driven by European powers during the 18th and 20th centuries, resulting in vast empires across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And while imperialist nations justify their actions as civilizing missions or bringing stability, it frequently led to cultural suppression, economic exploitation, and resistance from the local populations. And the effects of imperialism have had long-lasting impacts on global power dynamics, economic disparities, and cultural identities. Now, of course, we could see this in themes of Star Wars, as the Galactic Empire, the powerful authoritarian regime that seeks to extend its control across the galaxy, often through military conquest, suppression of rebellion, and the imposition of centralized rule. You could also see this in The Last Samurai, which is a film that follows a former American military officer who was hired to train the Japanese army in their efforts to suppress the samurai. The film explores a clash between traditional Japanese culture, represented by the samurai, and the forces of modernization, symbolized by the Japanese government's desire to adopt Western imperialist practices and strengthen their power. All right, next up, we're going to talk about absolute monarchism, and this is a form of monarchy in which the ruler holds supreme, unrestricted power over the state and its people, often justified by claims of divine right or hereditary rule. In absolute monarchy, the monarch has centralized control, making all key decisions without checks from other branches of government, and laws, policies, military actions, and state resources are typically managed at the sole discretion of the monarch, who is not bound by a constitution or legal limitations. This can be seen in the Chronicles of Narnia, with the White Witch, who can be called an absolute monarch trying to rule over Narnia, or maybe the Pevensey children, who are all little fascist monarchs. All right, next up, we're going to talk about colonialism, and this is a practice in which a powerful country establishes control over foreign territories, often by settling its own population there, exploiting resources, and imposing its culture, language, and governance on the local population. Driven by economic, strategic, and sometimes religious motives, colonialism typically results in the subjugation and marginalization of indigenous peoples who are often forced to work for the benefit of the colonizing nation and may face loss of land, rights, and autonomy. Colonizing powers such as Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal expanded their empires globally from the 15th to 20th centuries, shaping economies, cultures, and social structures across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. While colonizers attempted to justify their actions as civilizing missions, colonialism led to profound social and economic inequalities, resistance movements, and revolutions. You can see this in Avatar, as in Avatar, the human colonizers from Earth, us, are driven by economic motives to exploit the resources of Pandora, particularly the valuable mineral unobtainium, and the indigenous Na'vi people are seen as obstacles to the colonizers' goals, and the film mirrors the dynamics of colonialism by depicting the destruction of native cultures, displacement, and eventual resistance. And we could also see this in Pocahontas. Yeah, man, right on. Right on. All right, next up we talk about alt-right. And the alt-right, also short for alternative right, is a loosely organized far-right movement characterized by nationalist, anti-establishment, and often xenophobic or white supremacist views. Emerging primarily in the United States during the 2010s, the alt-right gained attention through online communities and social media where it used memes, satire, and internet culture to spread its ideology. While the movement encompasses a variety of beliefs, core elements often include opposition to multiculturalism, immigration, and political correctness, as well as advocacy for a predominantly white nationalist identity. And alt-right followers typically reject mainstream conservative views, seeing them as insufficient, and they often engage in provocative or controversial rhetoric to challenge established political and social norms. Now you can kind of see themes of this in American History X, as this was a film that tells the story of a former neo-Nazi skinhead and his transformation away from white supremacy, but it also delves into the alt-right and neo-Nazi subcultures, showing the radicalization of individuals through hate-filled ideologies centered around racial purity, anti-immigration views, and white nationalism. And you could also see this in the Purge series. And while the Purge series primarily focuses on societal violence and government-sanctioned anarchy, it also addresses themes of nationalism, xenophobia, and social division. And in some of the films, political leaders espouse policies that align with alt-right views, including anti-immigrant rhetoric, and the wealthy and powerful are shown as manipulating the system to keep marginalized groups oppressed. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about revolutionism. And revolutionism is an ideology that advocates for radical and often sudden change in a society's political, social, or economic structures, typically achieved through a revolution rather than gradual reform. Revolutionists believe that certain systems are fundamentally flawed, as seen in historical revolutions like the French, American, and Russian revolutions. While revolutionism can inspire profound societal change and challenge entrenched power, it also often leads to instability, conflict, and unpredictable outcomes, with new systems sometimes proving as challenging as those they replaced. Hunger Games is a really good example of this. Of course, the districts rebel against the capital, but as we see, President Coin is just as shitty as President Snow. Yeah, We see this in Les Miserables, which was set during the French Revolution, revolving around the lives of individuals affected by revolutionary ideas. And it's also kind of represented in Fight Club. As in Fight Club, our protagonist and his alter ego, Tyler, lead a revolution against consumerism and societal norms through the creation of Fight Club, and later Project Mayhem, with the goal of disrupting the existing social order and initiating radical change by undermining corporate control and societal values. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Marxism-Leninism. And this is a political ideology and framework that combines theories of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, serving as a foundation for communist movements and governments, particularly in the 20th century. Now, rooted in Marx's concepts of class struggle, historical materialism, and the need for a classless society, Marxism-Leninism adapts these ideas to advocate for a revolutionary vanguard party that leads the working class to overthrow capitalism. Lenin argued that this party, organized with strict discipline and unity, is essential to guide the proletariat, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then transition towards socialism and eventually communism. Marxism-Leninism emphasizes state control over the economy, centralized planning, and suppression of dissent, and this ideology shaped Soviet governance and influenced communist movements worldwide, though its centralized approach and authoritarian tendencies have faced criticism for limiting individual freedoms and leading to oppressive regimes. All right, next up we're going to talk about representative democracy, and this is a system of government in which citizens elect representatives to make decisions and create laws on their behalf, rather than participating directly in the legislative process. In this form of democracy, elected officials are accountable to the people and serve specific terms, with regular elections allowing voters to choose new representatives or re-elect current ones based on their performance. Representative democracy is widely practiced around the world in varying forms, often incorporating checks and balances among branches of government to prevent abuse of power and ensure that representatives act in the public interest. We see this in the West Wing, again, for obvious reasons, and also in House of Cards, which is a political thriller centered around Frank Underwood, a ruthless politician who manipulates the democratic system to gain power in the United States. All right, next up we're going to talk about particracy, and this is a form of government in which political parties play a dominant role in decision-making, often to the extent that the party interests outweigh those of individual representatives or citizens. Parties hold significant control over political processes, candidate selection, and policy direction, with elected officials typically expected to adhere closely to the party line rather than acting independently. Now, this is often seen in parliamentary systems where parties are the primary drivers of government formation and policy implementation. However, it can also reduce individual accountability and alienate citizens if party agendas take precedence over broader public interests. All right, next up we're going to talk about aristocracy, and this is a form of government in which power is held by a privileged elite class, typically made up of individuals who inherit their status, wealth, or titles. And historically, aristocracies were based on noble lineage, where aristocrats claimed authority due to their family background, often believing themselves to be better suited for leadership due to their education, wealth, or social status. And they were prominent in many historical societies such as ancient Greece, medieval Europe, and imperial China, where nobility wielded considerable power over common citizens. We could see themes of this in Downton Abbey, which is a British historical drama centered around the aristocratic Crawley family who own and run the large estate of Downton Abbey. Yeah, you could also see it in Aristocats. All right, next up, where do we talk about oligarchy? And this is a form of government in which power rests in the hands of a small elite group of people, often distinguished by wealth, family ties, corporate interests, or military control. In an oligarchic system, this select group makes decisions that impact the entire society, typically prioritizing their own interests, influence, and status. Unlike democracy, where power is more broadly distributed among the population, oligarchies centralize authority within a narrow segment of society, leading to limited public influence over policies. I think this is pretty well represented in Attack on Titan. Okay, so it's really good. But in the beginning point, our society within the walls, where the ruling elite, specifically within the most inner wall, maintain control of the population, hiding the true nature of the world from them. And they also prioritize their own survival and privilege at the expense of the general populace or the scout regiment. RIP. Give your hearts, man. Give your hearts. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about presidentialism. And this is a system of government where the executive branch is led by a president who serves as both the head of state and government, separate from the legislature. The president is usually elected independently through popular vote and serves a fixed term, ensuring a clear separation of powers. And this system emphasizes checks and balances, with the president holding distinct executive powers, such as vetoing legislation, appointing officials, and directing foreign policy. This could also be seen and represented in Lincoln, which is a historical historical drama directed by Steven Spielberg, centering around President Abraham Lincoln's leadership during the American Civil War, and portrays the president's role in guiding the country, managing the executive powers, and working with the legislature to pass the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Trumpism. And Trumpism is a political ideology and movement linked to the US President Donald Trump. It's defined by its populist, nationalist, and anti-establishment stance, and it's centered on, quote, America First policies. It emphasizes national sovereignty, strict immigration controls, and trade protectionism to prioritize American jobs and industries. Known for its confrontational style and rejection of traditional political norms, Trumpism appeals to those who are disillusioned with political elites, often challenging global alliances and media institutions, and it also incorporates cultural conservatism, focusing on patriotism, free speech, and preserving traditional American values. All right, next up, we're going to talk about homophobia, and this refers to negative attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors directed at individuals who identify as or are perceived to be lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It can manifest as discrimination, hostility, exclusion, or even violence, often rooted in cultural, religious, or personal biases. This prejudice perpetuates harmful stereotypes and limits social acceptance, equal rights, and opportunities for LGBTQ+ individuals. However, efforts to address homophobia include legal protection, education, and advocacy aimed at fostering inclusivity and equality, but it still remains a significant issue impacting the mental health, safety, and well-being of the LGBTQ+ communities worldwide. You can see themes of this in Brokeback Mountain, really popular one. Set in the American West, it focuses on the love story between two men who are forced to hide their relationship due to societal homophobia and the harsh expectations of masculinity in their environment. And there are also themes of this in Orange is the New Black, which is a series set in a women's prison that delves into themes of homophobia and LGBTQ+ rights, particularly on how LGBTQ+ prisoners are treated. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Islamism. And Islamism is a political ideology that aims to shape government, law, and society based on Islamic principles and interpretations of Sharia law. Now, unlike Islam, which is a diverse religion, Islamism focuses specifically on political application of Islamic teachings. It spans a spectrum from moderate groups advocating within democratic frameworks to radical movements pursuing revolutionary or militant tactics. You can see themes of this in The Message, which is a historical epic that tells the story of the life of Prophet Muhammad and the early history of Islam. And while the film itself does not directly explore Islamism as a political ideology, it provides an essential historical context for the understanding of how early Islamic principles, including governance by Sharia law, influenced the development of Muslim societies and politics. All right, next up, we're going to talk about Stalinism. And Stalinism is the political ideology of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, which was marked by extreme centralization, authoritarian control, and rapid industrialization through state-led economic planning and forced collectivization. This approach consolidated agriculture into collective farms, but ended up causing widespread famine and suffering. And Stalinism relied heavily on propaganda, censorship, and political repression, including purges and forced labor camps to maintain control and eliminate opposition. And while supporters credit Stalinism with transforming the USSR into a superpower, critics, of course, condemn it as a deviation from Marxist principles and a totalitarian regime rife with human rights abuses. You can see themes of this in The Death of Stalin, which is a satirical comedy drama and a direct portrayal of the power struggle following Joseph Stalin's death in 1953. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about democratic socialism, and this is a political and economic ideology that combines a democratic political system with a socialist economic framework. It seeks to ensure wealth and resources are more equally distributed by prioritizing public welfare over corporate profits, preserving individual freedoms, and democratic governance. All right, next up, we're going to talk about interventionism, and this is a foreign policy strategy where a nation actively involves itself in the affairs of others to protect its interests, ensure stability, or address humanitarian concerns. And this can include anything from diplomatic efforts, economic sanctions, or military actions aimed at shaping global events, supporting pro-democracy movements, or addressing crises. Now, the US is engaged in multiple interventions. It would be way too much to talk about right now. I covered this in a video called Every United States War Explained. But yeah, the US has done this a lot. Yeah, it's a thing. It's a thing. At times it's kind of been sketchy where the US has stepped in and low-key performed their own coups in different countries, but I don't know. It's whatever. You can see themes of this in Blood Diamond, which is a really fucking good movie that highlights the international community's intervention in the Sierra Leone Civil War, focusing on the diamond trade and the exploitation of child soldiers, and also in The Killing Fields, which is a movie set during the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia and depicts the tragic consequences of US intervention in Southeast Asia, especially the bombing campaigns in Cambodia and the resulting devastation. You could also see themes of this in the TV show 24. Yeah, it's about Jack Bauer, a counterterrorism agent who frequently deals with interventionist scenarios. And the show often explores the US government's involvement in international crises, including military interventions to prevent terrorist attacks, foreign coups, and nuclear threats. All right, next up, we're going to talk about neoliberalism, and this is an economic and political ideology rooted in classical liberal principles, emphasizing free market capitalism, minimal government intervention, deregulation, and privatization to drive economic growth and efficiency. It rose to prominence in the late 20th century, advocating for reducing state influence in the economy, lowering taxes, and cutting public spending, and fostering competition to stimulate innovation and prosperity. While supporters argue that it enhances economic freedom and raises living standards, critics also highlight its potential to exacerbate income inequality, weaken social protections, and erode public services. You kind of see themes of this in The Big Short, which is a film that explores the events leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, driven in part by neoliberal policies of deregulation and the promotion of risky financial products in the belief that free market forces would self-regulate themselves. And you could also see it in a movie called Thank You for Smoking, which is a satirical comedy following a spokesman for the tobacco industry who promotes the idea of personal responsibility while downplaying the harmful effects of smoking. And the film critiques neoliberal ideas of choice and deregulation, highlighting how industries use these concepts to avoid accountability and maximize profits. All right, next up, we're going to talk about liberal democracy. And this is a system of government that blends democratic principles like free elections and majority rule with strong protections for individual rights and civil liberties under the rule of law. Power is exercised by elected representatives, but is constrained by a constitution or legal framework that ensures freedoms such as speech, religion, and assembly, while also safeguarding minority rights. With checks and balances across the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, liberal democracies aim to prevent abuses of power and uphold accountability, and it's very common in Western nations, as this model fosters political competition, a free press, and judicial independence. All right, next up, we're going to talk about anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people based on their religion, ethnicity, or cultural identity. Now, throughout history, this is manifested in various forms, from social exclusion and stereotyping to violent persecution, including the Holocaust. And anti-Semitism persists globally, taking the form of conspiracy theories, derogatory language, and attacks on Jewish sites and practices, despite ongoing efforts to combat it through education, legal protections, and awareness campaigns. Now, you can definitely see themes of this in The Pianist, which is a biographical film that tells the story of a Jewish pianist who survives the Holocaust in Warsaw. Really good movie. Also in The Diary of Anne Frank, which was a 1959 adaptation of the famous Diary of Anne Frank, focusing on her life and hiding from the Nazis during the Holocaust. And there's also a pretty good TV show called Hunters, which is an Amazon Prime series that follows a group of Nazi hunters in the 1970s who tracked down former Nazis living in the US. And it touches on the legacy of Nazi anti-Semitism, portraying the lasting trauma and desire for justice among Jewish survivors. All right, next up, we're going to talk about individualism. And this is a philosophy that prioritizes individual autonomy, rights, and self-reliance over collective or state control, emphasizing personal freedom and responsibility, and is often linked to liberal democracies and free market economies, where people are encouraged to pursue their own personal goals, make independent choices, and prioritize their own interests, fostering innovation and societal progress. While advocates highlight its role in promoting creativity and self-determination, critics caution that it can also undermine social cohesion and mutual support by overemphasizing individual interests at the expense of community bonds. You can see themes of this in Breaking Bad, which is an iconic series that focuses on Walter White, a high school chemistry teacher that turned into a methamphetamine manufacturer because he kind of had to. And the whole story really embraces an individualistic path of self-determination after literally being marginalized by society. Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. You could also see this in The Mandalorian, which follows the story of a lone bounty hunter who values personal freedom and operates independently of larger political structures. All right, next up, we're going to talk about transphobia. And transphobia is prejudice or hostility towards transgender individuals or those who challenge traditional gender norms. Now, it could appear as Negative attitudes, harassment, or systemic discrimination in areas like employment, healthcare, and legal rights, often fueled by rigid beliefs about gender or a lack of understanding. And this bias poses serious mental health and safety challenges for transgender people, limiting their access to opportunities and affecting their overall well-being. And combating transphobia involves education, inclusive policies, anti-discrimination laws, and raising awareness to foster acceptance and support for gender diversity. You see themes of this in The Danish Girl, which is a film based on the true story of Lily Elbe, one of the first people to undergo gender confirmation surgery, and explores the struggles Lily faces in a society that is deeply transphobic. You can also see themes of this in Boys Don't Cry, which is a film based on the real-life story of Brandon Tina, a transgender man who was brutally murdered in Nebraska. And the film depicts the severe transphobia Brandon faces in a small conservative town, including the harassment, discrimination, and violence. All right, next up we're going to be talking about eco-socialism, and this is a political ideology merging socialism and environmentalism, advocating for a system that ensures social equality and ecological sustainability. It critiques capitalism for driving environmental degradation and social inequality through its profit-driven, growth-focused model, and instead, eco-socialists propose collectively managing resources to meet human needs while preserving the environment. They emphasize renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and conservation, advocating for policies like nationalizing key industries, creating green jobs, and establishing social safety nets to support sustainable transitions. All right, next up we're going to talk about parliamentarism, and this is a system of government where the executive branch derives its authority and legitimacy from the legislative branch, or parliament, and remains accountable to it. In this system, the head of government, usually a prime minister, is chosen from the majority party or coalition in parliament and can be removed through a vote of no confidence. Unlike presidential systems, which emphasize separation of powers, parliamentarism features a fusion of powers, fostering a close relationship between the executive and legislature. You can see themes of this in The Iron Lady, which is a biographical film about Margaret Thatcher, the first female prime minister of the United Kingdom, and it also provides a little bit of insight into the role of the prime minister within a parliamentary system. All right, next up we're going to talk about anti-radicalism, and this is an ideological stance that opposes extreme political, social, or economic changes, favoring moderation, stability, and gradual reform within established frameworks. It seeks to preserve existing social orders and institutions, viewing rapid revolutionary changes as destabilizing and potentially harmful. Anti-radical movements often emerge during periods of upheaval, advocating for incremental adjustments to address issues rather than sweeping reforms. But yeah, we're done. I hope you guys enjoyed. Happy holidays again. This is part 1 of a very long series. I can't wait to see all the people arguing about shit in the comments. Again, hope you enjoyed, and I love you, bro.